Recording. All right, good evening, everyone. It's good to see everybody. It's been a few weeks since I've gotten to interact with you. So I am looking forward to covering 3 topics for this evening. The first one, some more information on functional analyses and functional behavior assessments in general. Second one, a little bit of information about behavior intervention plans. And the third one is really to discuss a few issues related to preference assessments. So that is what our agenda will entail for this evening. And as always, if you have any questions specific to those, you can text me or put them in the chat window. I don't always see the chat window, so that could be a problem. But if you text me, the phone will ring and that will clue me in. My cell phone number, as always, is on the course syllabus for those of you that don't have it or don't use it that often. And I think we're ready to go, if that's the case. So to remind everyone, the functional analysis is a component of a functional behavior assessment. And if you go back to our chapter, our PowerPoint on functional behavior assessments, I showed a triangle, and that triangle showed the continuum. And at the top of that continuum, the smallest part of the triangle, the tip, was the functional analysis. And the bottom part of it were things like indirect assessments, direct observations, and so on. So I am reiterating this again because I think both Dr. Shainman and myself have gotten numerous emails and text about FBAs associated with people's particular job sites, all right? And so what I want to emphasize to you is that as an approved program, we need to make sure that people are engaging in activities that are not specific to any one job site, because we don't know where our candidates are going to end up in a year, 2 years, or so on. I mean, look, this is meant to be a compliment. Most of you guys are in your early to mid 20s, not everyone, so I don't want to offend everyone that's over 30. But the likelihood of, you know, if you move out of state, if you change companies, if you have to relocate, if you get out of the field and get back in again, it's pretty high. I mean, we live in a world where things change all the time. And I think, you know, we got that learn unit this year, of course. But it's really important to make sure that we are meeting our standards, that we are designated, accredited, and approved to meet. And that means that we have to teach you things that are global in nature. Now, with that said, as a sidebar, someone might make comment to that and say, well, you guys are very specific about CAPAS methodology. So how is that preparing us for other things? Well, it is, because if you are smart enough to unpack the acronym of CAPAS, the first word is comprehension application of behavior analysis. So that means it draws from all of the tactics, all of the research, the 300 plus differentiated tactics in behavior analysis since the beginning of time, and just teaches people how to apply those to all aspects of an organization. The schooling part can be interchanged, as with other entities that I've worked with that also use the CAPAS model. Prisons, general ed classrooms, clinics, hospitals, IBM, and so on. So that's important. That's one of the reasons why First of all, our program is accredited to do both. So with that said, you are going to have specific issues that are occurring at your practicum sites, right? However, our response to that cannot be to acquiesce to the practicum site. We just can't do that. That would fly in the face of all of our accreditation standards. So please keep that in mind. It's just like if you're in medical school, you have to be working at a hospital that's going to support your efforts in supporting you as a student in medical school. That has nothing, that may or may not have anything to do with your job or your future career at that point, with the exception that if you don't learn how to use comprehensive and universal procedures, then your effectiveness and your skill set may be tremendously labored at that point. So keep this in mind. We have to figure out a way for you to be able to do what you need to do as a future a teacher or a behavior analyst to make sure that you are going to have a skill set and be successful. That is what our whole program is accredited to do. So with that said, I want to take the FA apart, all right? Again, I've gotten feedback from individuals that are saying, well, we only do FAs at our job site, so we don't do all these interview things. The interviews are part of the continuum, and they're part of the process. I don't know what else to tell you. We don't want to reinvent the wheel here. And then I've gotten feedback from others that are saying they just do the interviews and the observations. They come up with the hypothesis, and that's what they go with. They don't do FAs. Again, it really depends on the situation and the learner and the target problem. The whole thing is part of a functional behavior assessment. It doesn't mean you always have to do the whole thing, but you need to learn how to do the whole thing, right? Just like Italian DI programs say the whole thing, well, I got to get you to learn the whole thing, okay? So we're going to shift to a way that we could kind of unpack the FA into smaller parts, which will allow us to FA now. We're on the FA, we're on the top of the pyramid here. I am assuming that the other pieces are not the problem, all right? We're at the top of the pyramid here, and we're going to take it apart and look at corresponding data that could hypothetically go with it. So you're going to be a little bit better equipped to analyze graphs that you're developing under these conditions. All right, any questions before I start? All right, one thing that I did want to mention is that Greg Hanley has devoted a lot of his research over the last, I guess, 3 to 5 years on different variations of the functional analysis. Now, it still requires experimentation, of course, because that's what makes it a functional analysis. That's number one. And number two, I don't think he's done anything to compromise all the work that others have done prior to that. But I do see some utility in what he's doing, of course, in all aspects of things that I do. So when I start seeing that, I want to make sure that you guys are aware of that and can start looking at some of his work. So he's the guy that's done research on the brief functional analysis, which I think is really important because it kind of allows us to do things in a short amount of time. And it basically tells us that if we do things right, the data coming out of that shorter amount of time is equally as informative as it would be if you take a longer amount of time. So that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at this. The other thing that I know that Dr. Shanman's covered, but I cannot emphasize it enough, is you can do a functional analysis on appropriate behavior also. You can do it on effective teaching. You could do it on any of the programs that you are running. Now, a lot of what your time is spent doing that in Dr. Cohen's class, but I do not want you to think that a functional analysis can only be conducted under aberrant behavior. In fact, if you look in DTS, I remember when we were putting this together, we made sure that I think there's something called the functional analysis of aberrant behavior to separate it from just functional analysis in general. So keep this in mind. You can take any aspect of a learner's behavior and functionally analyze this. And to illustrate that, to end this evening, I did a functional analysis on the home environment to determine under what conditions would we see stereotypy more or less. And I want to share that with you before we end this evening's class. So the sections that I'm going to share with you regarding the FA are the sections that correspond with the different conditions that we use when we're manipulating the environment for a functional analysis of aberrant behavior. All right, so the way that this is broken down, I think it's highly effective. I'm not going to read everything to you, but notice that under each condition, there are references. And I think that is very critical. That should help you to get to some literature that would assist you in actually conducting the procedure. So with the attention condition, our rationale is to create an environment where the problem behavior is going to get reinforced vis-a-vis attention. And so when we talk about attention, we need to think about everything that's social. All right, so we know we need to have another being in the environment. We know we need to have eye contact, possibly physical contact. It could be reprimands, it could be approvals, but there needs to be some attention that is dedicated to that target behavior. So if the individual's target behavior becomes worse under these conditions, then we may be able to ascertain that outside of these conditions, outside of that arrangement, it could be the same conditions, we may actually attribute the problem behavior to the same source of reinforcement. So the procedure, you always start with a timer. You would instruct the individual to play with toys. Then you ignore the child at that point. No verbal interaction, no eye contact, nothing that resembles any of the things that you're about to have to do, okay? At this point, what you would actually do is once you get a target behavior that is being emitted, you would then change what you're doing and you would reference it. You would respond to it. You may touch, you may look at the individual at that point, but it's only supposed to match up with the target behavior. So please keep that in mind. So you start off with just with a recreated environment, and only when you see that appropriate behavior, the target behavior, do you provide those social components, right? Just remember, and keep in mind that a reprimand is attention, all right? So you could do something like, come on, Brittany Bonin, I can't believe you're biting your nails again, all right? Give me a break. How is that gonna look in your wedding picture? I don't know, I'm just making something up, okay? That would be considered attention, and that would also be a reprimand, okay? The two are the same. It doesn't have to be a reprimand to be considered attention, of course. It could sound like this. Now look, you little sweet thing. I don't want you to eat that finger off, all right? You're such a good girl, all right? And so regardless of how it sounds, what you are providing in that situation is attention. And it needs to be attached to all types of attention. All right, any questions?
Yeah. I have a funny kind of like, I don't know if Catherine, okay. So you're scoring it on whether the behavior stops when you provide the attention?
No, you're scoring it on whether the behavior, it occurred, you provided it. It occurred, you provided it. You are looking for it to occur. So every occurrence, you are recording it. What you have to make sure you're doing is you are providing it. So what you're doing, Bobby, is you have identified the conditions under which all behavior is occurring. So that needs to be the consequence. It's not going to work if you don't provide it because it's not an attention condition at that point. So here is the condition. You are adhering to that practice and you're just recording the occurrence of the behavior.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, all right. Now, if you don't create the condition, you could still record it and call it the attention condition, but it's really not that. That's why you really have to be overt in the process. All right, so if that's the case, and if it is being maintained by that response, then this is what your graph is going to look like for attention, okay? Now, keep in mind, in this graph, it is possible that they did an attention condition for 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the afternoon, 5 minutes in the evening, and the same thing with demands and play. So on the first day, they may have gotten 6 different conditions, and this is what shows up on the graph, all right? So if you do that every day, all right, this, and there's a predominant source of reinforcement that historically maintains that behavior, then that is what it's going to show up like on the graph. So each of those days in this example would contain at least 3 sessions. You don't have to break it down by the way I described, but you could. But at the end of the day, you would accumulate all of the sessions under which you had attention, under which you had demand, under which you had play, and then if you have an alone condition. It says frequency of aggression here. You can also do it by rate. So let's say you had 22 minutes of attention and 22 behaviors. Then that is a rate of 1 behavior per minute. But let's say you had 10 minutes of demands, and because that's just the way it played out, and only 5 emissions of behavior, then it would be 0.5 every minute of your rate. And then let's say play, you had 22 out of 11, then it's 2 per minute. So rate is a great way of leveling the playing field when you don't have the same amount of minutes. And I think for people that might work, well, you guys all work in an applied setting. Nobody works in an experimental lab. You may have that variation in the number of minutes you're able to collect data on each of those sessions. There are other ways you can do this. You could dedicate a day to all of the session, to all one type of condition, and then just alternate it. It usually takes a little bit longer to do that. All right, I think this is really important. to develop an integrity checklist. Note on your research summaries, I always have this place for you to talk about treatment integrity. So in this case, the treatment is the condition. And so it's the point is use some type of TPRA or recording so it can be viewed later to determine if, yes, you did create this condition. And it kind of goes back to my response to Bobby. If the data are not there, and they might not be for legitimate reasons, you always want to eliminate if it has anything to do with the integrity of you recreating that condition. All right, and notice what they're suggesting is that it doesn't need to occur throughout the whole session. If you have 5 minutes worth of this type of treatment integrity data, that's probably good enough. But what I like about how this group identified things is they have the critical attributes of what's supposed to be going on in each of the sessions. I recently had, I did some CEUs, and this is what I did my CEUs in. And I think that it's always important to, once you do a CEU, to find a portal by which to share it with others. And so this worked perfectly because I knew that this evening I was going to have this class. All right. And then even a space for performance feedback. So the CEUs that I took were basically on how to get your staff to do this well. So that's why it kind of looks a little bit like that. And that's why there's some performance-based feedback there. All right, any other questions about attention condition before we go on to escape? All right, I guess that means no. So when we think of escape, usually there's something that's aversive that is present. And our behavior will actually remove that aversiveness. Avoidance is kind of the same thing, but it basically means that the aversiveness is looming. It's not necessarily there just yet. So in a case like today, we had clouds and the threat of rain was looming. So anything that I did to protect myself from rain at that point would have still been likely negative reinforcement, but based on avoidance. However, once it starts raining, what I've done not to get wet is escape. So just in general, keep those two things in mind. They're both negative reinforcement. So we're creating a demand situation. So if I don't want to get wet, the clouds and the rain create a demand situation for me. So here's what we have to keep in mind. A lot of times when we're talking about demand situations, we're talking about instructional delivery and instructional setup. So if you're coming from a school classroom or a clinical classroom, that is your assumption, right? Are we all on the same page with that? That the presentation of instruction is a demand situation. That is probably a good place for you guys to start. However, I do want to throw in this little caveat, and this is an important caveat. It really becomes much more demanding, or even demanding, period, when the schedule of reinforcement is not appropriate. So if you have the right schedule of reinforcement, and you're truly delivering accurate learn units, the schedule of reinforcement increases. And if it increases from a level that is really allows you to sustain appropriate interactions and behavior, it's not a demand situation anymore, because the individual is getting some really great things from that situation. So the aversiveness has been diluted. So I really want you to think about that. I do not want you to get into this habit of thinking that the presentation of instruction is automatically demand. It is very demanding when you don't have the right schedule of reinforcement, when you don't have a reinforcer, or I would argue when you're really not teaching with learn units, because that could just mean you're asking the individual to do something and it might not be calibrated at just the right level for that person to learn something. Or if it's too high and you're in a public school setting where you're having to deliver instruction on a grade level without any reference to the person's performance level, those are not learn units either. And that is a demand situation, okay? One of the whole purposes of taking any instruction that you have to deliver and turning it into learn units is to make it less aversive, all right? Now, when you get learners that have a more established instructional history, where their history prior to you being the deliverer of instruction was aversive in terms of delivering instruction, then you've got to work your way out of that. But for learners that have been getting hopefully robust services for a while now, the instruction should not be a demand situation. So keep in mind that demand is relative to the amount of reinforcement that is forthcoming. The more you're forced to have to do something with not a whole lot of reinforcement, the increase in that it increases what we consider a demand situation. And I want you to apply that to yourself, right? So if you have to walk in the rain, if I'm really milking Mother Nature today, and get soaking wet for $1 million, like you get through the rain for $1 million, you're completely wet, everything's wet, and you get the money, all right? I don't know about you, but I'm walking every day 5 times a day to get that $1 million, okay? But if you're walking in the rain just to get to your car, you might not actually do it because that is pretty demanding. So think about that, and you know, there's other things that end up getting chained onto that, possibly getting to your car to go to work because you might lose your job because you've missed a bunch of days. And that's another aversive situation. So you could change some things on there to change the dynamic of what I proposed. But I do want you to think of it that way, all right? With that said, that's pretty much what we have to go by. What I find is helpful is that when I'm, you know, oddly enough, I've done most of my functional analyses as a public school teacher rather than as a clinician, because the first 17 years of my career was spent in this field as a public school teacher. So what I would do in those situations is I had children that were okay with instruction, but they were not okay with other types of directions. It's time to pick up that toy, all right? It's time to line up and go to lunch. You were sitting here, now you need to sit here. Close your book, open your book. Those things seem to be more problematic than when it was just us sitting down one-to-one delivering instruction with a high schedule of reinforcement. So when I had to do FAs in those situations, it was really all about following some basic instructions, okay? So if we unpack this here, here's what I want you to think about. You're gonna provide the individual with some instruction to complete a task. That could be academic, it could be something you're working one-to-one with, or it could be anything else. But make that decision based on that child's instructional history and instructional history with you. So you deliver it, you wait 5 seconds, they give you a response, great, it's a correct response. But if you don't get a response, then you repeat the instruction, model or demonstrate Wait 5 seconds for a response. If you get it, I would call that a prompted response. All right, and in here they suggest level 1 prompted. If no response occurs, what they're suggesting is repeat it again, then physically guide the student through the process. You will hold the cup and put it down. This is how we do that. All right. And then they recommend that regardless, provide praise after that. And one of the reasons why they're suggesting this is even though you had to prompt them through it, they still didn't get it right the first time. So there is some escape from that initial response that you are trying to determine what's going on there. That is what you're looking at. It took much more of a rigmarole, that's a scientific word actually, to get them to do it. And that's what you're looking for. What does it take to get the child to do the thing if they ever do it? And the more it takes, the more likely that behavior is functioning for escape. Now, again, all bets are off if the child does not have the prerequisite skills to engage in the task, right? And that's why it's really important to figure that out from the get-go. So if you see that they are emitting, they're throwing the desk or whatever it is that your target behavior is, then that you want to turn away from, and you want to have a brief moment in time that's generally about 30 seconds. If it occurs again, another 30 seconds before you initiate another demand, another instruction. All right, so it's that last part that would allow for you to record the occurrence of the behavior. So what you're gonna you're gonna have your level 1 prompting, your level 2 prompting, and then you're gonna have, if they emitted the target behavior at any time during that session, if they never did it, you're going to record that. If they emitted the target behavior in the level 1 prompt, you're going to record that you had to go to a level 1 prompt and the target behavior was being emitted. So at some point, you have access to 2 pieces of data here. How many responses were completed on the first try, and all the level of prompting it took to get them there. That can be helpful to determine escape. And then if you see problem behavior at any time embedded in there, or after it's over, or whatever, before you present the next one, that is your main dependent variable, and that's what you're going to look at first. So if the target behavior was running around the classroom, what is really helpful is that you gave the instruction, they did not follow it, gave them a prompt 1, record that, but they did follow it, no running around the classroom. The next time you had to go to a prompt 2, record that. The next time they ran around the classroom. So what you're going to be able to see as a bigger picture is that to start off with, this worked to a certain degree, then this worked to a certain degree, but then after that, all bets were off. It's going to give you much more enriched information than if you're just recording and graphing whether the problem behavior occurred or not. All right, this one's a little trickier and you have to look for a couple of different things, but it also actually reveals if you're reinforcing delayed responding or prompted responses, and you start to see more responding under additional prompt levels, then that's going to tell you that maybe the likelihood of your correction procedures are compromised. All right, so let's look at the graph. Again, there's not going to be a whole lot of difference here with all the graphs that they're showing. That's the one thing I didn't necessarily like about it. But what you have to see is that under that condition, something gets shaken off with the data. So you see how we are not seeing a whole lot of difference between the attention and the play condition. So it's what does predominantly look like. There's a difference under those conditions. If this graph would be here, then it would be inconclusive. First of all, it's not only inconclusive, but it's happening at such low levels. Nah, you don't even need to do a functional assessment. If all of these are higher and entangled, then you have a multiply maintained behavior. That's the difference from when they're entangled at the top or entangled at the bottom. They can both be inconclusive if there are any occurrences. All right, an integrity checklist for this. And then this is my favorite part. If the problem behavior occurs, ignore it, turn away for 30 seconds. The reason why is that that's enough time that has elapsed to make sure that the presentation of the next learn unit, I'm using that term loosely, does not serve as a reinforcer for the client's behavior. All right, any questions since that one was a little bit more complicated?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my dog wants to attend class with us. I know this is specific to the FA that I conducted with my supervisor, but in our FA for the escape conditions, we did a set of conditions where we had an antecedent change, so we were interrupting rigid patterns of behavior we changed the antecedent, and then we're following the conditions for the consequences. But for the interrupting phase for the escape condition, we had to interrupt the behavior, so we were therefore providing her with attention by stopping her from doing the behavior. So when you analyze the data, how would that change how you analyze it if you know that you provided an escape consequence, but you also provided attention because you interrupted the behavior change?
However, I think in your case, and I could be completely wrong, Maddie, but I think in your case, you end up with two demand conditions, because I think the interrupting is a demand condition.
Okay, I understand.
Okay. And here's why I think it's a more of a demand or aversive condition than attention. Because the stereotypy is already automatically reinforcing, right? So it is about trying to stop access to reinforcement. And no matter what you do to do that, it is demanding. Does that make sense?
It does. I was just confused because even though, like you said, it's an aversive, it's a demand condition because I'm stopping that ritualistic behavior. I just didn't know if it counted as attention because I am interacting with her rather than turning away for those 30 seconds.
I see what you're saying about as attention, but it's not attention that is necessarily the source of reinforcement because the stereotype is the reinforcement.
Right.
Okay.
Being able to complete the ritual is the reinforcement.
You could be adding to it, okay? But I think that for the purposes of your work, you would have to go by the rule that that is assumed to be another demand situation, okay?
Okay.
With attention in regards to delivering instruction, that at least has an instructional history of being paired with reinforcement. So the likelihood of that having reinforcing properties is much higher than the function of blocking. The
Right.
stereo. Okay.
Often something we know to be like automatically reinforcing.
Right. All right, so in this play condition, basically we're trying to use it as a comparison condition, where when you have access to things that are reinforcing and there will be no demands, there will be no attention for problem behavior, what's occurring? All right, that is really what you're looking at here. So we have at least one adult and a client in a room. A lot of different known reinforcers present. You want to keep what I'm going to call an observational distance. So not outside of the room necessarily, but you don't have to be sitting like leg to leg with the kid. Okay, so somewhere in the middle. You need to be able to interact to a certain degree. And what they've suggested here is once every about 30 seconds. But problem behavior is ignored, of course, if it's self-injurious, life of the client or life of others at risk here, then you have to reconsider that. So it's pretty straightforward. This one's pretty straightforward. I think that the integrity treatment, toys are present, you're providing appropriate attention or attention to appropriate behavior about every 30 seconds. You're not attending to the inappropriate behavior. You're recording the problem behavior, and it's about a 5-minute duration. And that's it. Okay, so that's the easiest of all. If you don't really see a whole lot of differential between the play condition and other conditions, could tell you a couple of things. It could, first of all, you're likely going to see it a lot in the alone condition, the problem behavior, because the reason why it's permeated all conditions is because the individual probably does not have a very wide community of reinforcers. Okay, that's whether the target behavior is based on aggression, self-injurious, stereotypy, it doesn't matter. You know, you're going to probably see it a lot in alone conditions if they don't have a wide community of reinforcers. So just keep that in mind. And in the play condition, you may actually see it more to a certain degree, because it's possible that even what you're providing as toys, even if you've seen them play with it, if they're not conditioned reinforcers, it may not have an impact, and you may still see it pretty high. So you are looking that you see a reduction of the problem behavior in this condition, or something that is very different from the other conditions. All right, alone. All right, so what we want to see at this time is there automatic reinforcement embedded in the problem behavior? So for self-injurious, it can certainly be automatic reinforcement. It's not necessarily stereotypy, of course, but there could certainly be some automatic reinforcement provided. I see this a lot with biting. You know, there's something that occurs when you bite yourself. It does release some level of endorphin. When you hit your head, and there are some things that actually might seem painful to us, but for some individuals, it releases more of the pleasure center than anything else. And we see that a lot in sexually deviant behavior also. I have a former student of mine, Fauna Stockwell, who is one of the leading researchers in sexually deviant behavior as it applies, not as it applies to behavior analysis, studying it from a behavior analytic perspective. And I think that's one thing, you know, that's I think about when I think about my former students, a lot of them have gone on to things that are very different from their training, but they learn the principles with kids with no language first. That is how it all started for them. I have another candidate, former student of mine who I actually just talked to right before this class, and he's in the Midwest right now, and he's one of the leading researchers in using ABA for dementia and Alzheimer's. And again, very much got his start with working with very young children without language. And I think what happens is you get to see the principles of behavior in the purest form. So when you're working with someone that you see the operant form right before your eyes, that's pretty amazing. And then from that point, once you learn the principles, you can apply it to anything you're interested in. So I remember for years, prior to me getting to Nichols, when I was at a different university, I'd have people, students that would come to my office and their knees were shaking because other professors weren't always that accommodating when people had ideas about how to use behavior analysis. And this was primarily when I was in Chicago. And I can remember, talk about somebody's instructional history coming with it. Well, I talked to Dr. And she said that, I'm never going to make a career if I go into organizational business behavior management. And I was like, well, maybe that's some good advice. I think that Dr. knows a lot, and I think you want to take this into consideration. But, you might want to look at some other options, and this is why. And so it's exciting to see those people doing the very things that I think that I encourage them to do. So that was a little side note, but I want you to think about that for yourselves as you're ending program. So again, in this situation, you want to take yourself out of the mix. There are really no demand situations here. There's not much here. There's nothing. If you are physically present, you have to be really kind of isolated and present. So in a corner, maybe in a desk with a petition. If that petition is flimsy, you want to take that into consideration. If you can be in an observation room, that's even better. And of course, the individual would, we need to make sure that there are no behaviors that would be emitted that the individual can cause them harm with. If it's head banging or something of the sorts, you might want to be present. But again, you always want to take those things into consideration. I guess always consider that if there's not an issue regarding automatic reinforcement, so if it's possible that the behaviors are not related to automatic reinforcement, like if you've been working with the client for a long time and you have definitive current data to show that, you could skip that condition. However, what I'm finding more and more is that I can't always eliminate it now. It's like the more you learn and the more you know and the more experience you have, you realize, wait a minute, I think it's possibly automatic reinforcement. I see this a lot with some types of verbal behavior. So the echoic or the palalia in and of itself. And so, I personally do quite a few FAs with language, and under what conditions do we see more of this faulty verbal operant or faulty verbal behavior? And when we're doing this, I do see it really spiking in that alone condition. So there's something that's automatically reinforcing about what they're hearing, what they're saying. That's basically where the automatic reinforcement comes down to. The source of reinforcement in that case is the correspondence. You ever had an earworm on a song and you just say the same thing over and over? That it's the correspondence of what you heard and what you're saying. That means the same thing. That not means the same thing. That is the same source of reinforcement. All right. Okay, let's take a look at this. Yes, I'm listening.
I'm sorry. Would there be a way to, I'm just thinking, and what you said, it just kind of, it made me think of a client that I'm working with right now. So it's interesting. Would you say that there's a way to, if you're doing an FA for like non-functional vocalizations, and you said, you know, like the correspondence of hearing what they're saying is automatically reinforcing, would there be a way to do a set of conditions and to determine if they're listening to you is reinforcing, like to see if the reason that listening to themselves is reinforcing is because listening to you is not?
Okay, yes. So have you read the research by Amoy Kido Hugh? She's the one, and there's a couple of people that have done this, but she did the research on no stereotypy, no vocal stereotypy, and you pipe in the music, or the opposite. You have vocal stereotypy and you stop it, you take out the music. You could do the same thing with your voice and other voices. Okay, but if you haven't looked at those studies, I would highly recommend that you look at that. Her dissertation, of course, is going to take a lot of time. Let me see if I have it here, but it is worth it to just even read the literature, because part of what we can't figure out with stereotypy, especially vocal stereotypy, is, are they doing it covertly sometimes? So, you know, we did the studies on under what conditions do we see less of it. So for example, under writing conditions, we typically saw less of it. However, we saw less of it and heard less of it, but what if it just shifted to covert? We don't know. Now, I've heard, you know, psychologists infer that, oh, but they can't do it covertly because then they wouldn't be able to write. But I think that's a typical psychologist response where you're leaping to something that you infer. We don't know that. We don't have anything to measure it with. You could ask him, but it's a one-off in terms of a response, you know. Let me see if I, no. Let me try one other thing.
I have a question about the alone condition.
Yeah.
How can you know that problematic behavior admitted in the alone condition is not due to, like, it's not attention seeking or due to like boredom, since there's nothing else in the space, and not automatic reinforcement? Okay, but when you're talking about boredom, you are talking about an antecedent issue, not a consequential issue. When you're doing an FA, you are creating conditions that are related to consequences. Okay? Does that make sense? No? Yes? Maybe? Yes. But like, how do you make the distinction when you're measuring, when the behavior is emitted?
I don't understand. Like, you're trying to make a distinction. You're only recording the data if it occurs under those conditions. That is why you would have to do a different analysis to look at what's going on antecedent-wise.
Okay.
You're not trying to parse out other things. Now, in relation to boredom, I am going to give you this piece of information. So we did a study a few years ago, and the data, we actually got 2 other people to replicate this. And so we're putting it all together right now. So I would say it's pretty hot off the press, but it's related to studies that, wait, let me just see if Amoy has this in here, that have been done before, okay? Now, we took adult neurotypical individuals. Follow me so far? Okay. We put them in a waiting room, so to speak. All right, like they were coming in for an appointment. They knew they were going to have to see someone. We put them in a waiting room, and we told them, "You might be here for a little while." When we did this in a counterbalanced way. So we set them up. They had magazines, artwork on the walls, placards that were posted with signage. Okay, you follow me so far? All right, everybody's good? Can you envision what we're looking at? A bouquet of flowers, things like that. All right. So, and they could not have cell phones. Okay, that was one thing. And there was no, just because we didn't have one, there was no like ambient television playing. Okay, so we put them in the room and we timed them. And guess what we were looking for? Any sign of this. Tapping the foot, rocking, anything like that, okay? So what do you think the source of reinforcement for that is, Bobby?
It would be automatic.
Right, so,
Okay.
but, right, and so what we did is, as the time progressed, we started taking things out of the room. And we told them this before. We said, look, we're moving some things around. There might be people coming in here, moving some things around. Don't think anything of it. You know, somebody will be with you within a certain amount of time. And then for other individuals, we started them off with nothing in the room at all. Nothing. Okay, a chair and a place to sit, that was it. So what we found is that as long as there was something in the room, whether it was a placard, we saw less stereotypy. But the minute there was nothing in there, a very short amount of time, we saw some form of stereotypy, something. We saw one lady reach for her cell phone 27 times in like 5 minutes. And she started talking to herself. Oh, they told, sorry, I had to put my cell phone with, you know, with the guard. And so when we talked to people after, you know what they told us? They said, oh, I did that because I was bored. It was out of boredom. All right, so generally speaking, any repetitive behavior likely is associated with boredom, but that's not what's maintaining it over time. It is that when there is nothing else for you to do, you're going to emit a lot of stereotypy. So if it's a child that doesn't have a lot of reinforcers, whatever it is that you're doing is meaningless because they're going to do the thing that they can do the quickest to obtain reinforcement, and that is typically physical or motorical stereotypy, right? So you see why that distinctions.
Yes, that makes sense.
Help. Okay, all right, good. I love it when the one example I'm hanging my hat on serves to explain things. All right, what about to everybody else? Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I do want to, wait, where am I? Why can't I get back to where I was before? Oh no, I know. Oh no. That's bad when you're out of sorts on your own computer. Huh? Aha, okay. Here we go. Let's look at the integrity checklist for the alone condition. I think that's really important. By the way, would this be beneficial if I'd send it to you guys? Is this helpful?
Yes, please.
Okay, good,
Absolutely.
good. Individual is alone in the room, no toys or materials present, problem behavior is recorded, 5-minute session in duration. Again, I think that is a good place to start. That doesn't mean you only have one 5-minute session in a day. And at the end of the day, you simply just add up all of your sessions, okay? But I think that's a manageable amount of time. And notice it kind of aligns with what I tell people about conditioning sessions, right? 5 minutes. So there's something about that 5-minute span of time that I think is quite important. It's enough to garner the right information, but it's not too much to where it's going to change the person's instructional history. Okay, and I think that is important. All right, let me shift. I'll send you this link. They give us an online link, and if you get the whole thing, it's chapter 6 that they're referring to here. All right. All right, so I've sent this link directly to Dr. Shanman, and if you're in his section, you'll get it through him. And now I'm going to send it to people in my section because that's the only way I can do it. That's done. All right. I'm going to get to one graph that I want to show you related to functional analysis we did in families' homes. Well, possibly, if this opens up. Might be something I've already shared with you, but probably. What's going on? Oh, now it shows up. Now I'm going to get the document 15 times because I clicked on it so many times. All right, stop share. Okay, let me just look at some of the chat window stuff while I pull this up. All right, so I emailed it to everyone and I sent it to Dr. Shanman. So bug him if you don't get it, if you're in his section. Name of the author, it's Amoy, A-M-O-Y, Keto, first name. Second hyphenated name is Keto, K-I-T-O-Hugh, H-U-G-H. And if I remember correctly, there was another marriage in there and there was another name, Penny, P-E-N-N-I-E. And I don't remember when she did the work, who she was married to. So I can't tell you what last name to look for, all right? Brooke, for behaviors with high rates during FA, is it appropriate to take behavior in instances, behavior data, in, for example, separated by 3 seconds? I think if you might not have a choice, it could be, but you have to report that, Brooke. So you would have to say that this underreported the occurrence, okay? So I think that's possible. Also, if it's high rates, then it's possible that you can do it for a shorter amount of time. Should we rate our own performance that included in the papers from Bobby? You could. That could be interesting. And then you have some type of treatment fidelity. I think that's really interesting. Shows me that you're going the extra mile. Bob. All right. So this was, we presented this at ABAI a few years ago, and then we recently did a presentation for Oxnard Medical Center to the psychiatrist there for their monthly grand rounds. Play from current slide. So this is kind of what we did. We modified the home environment pre and post using conditioning procedures on stereotypy. How many of you have seen this presentation, either at a conference or I probably so, or in class, right? Let me just get to, so most of these kids had been through a conditioning study before. We conditioned some things to acquire reinforcing properties, some were not, so semi-successful. What wasn't changing was what was happening to the stereotypy when they were in an environment with objects previously associated with stereotypy were present. So we wanted to manipulate that in the home environment to determine what was happening. And we did a functional analysis of this to make that determination, okay? Let me just get straight to the graph. All right, this was how we arranged things. So we counterbalanced the order of the conditions, and we felt that that was very important because we always want to eliminate that it's not the sequence of the way you did things, or it's not the passage of time. So let's say that you're doing a study and it's always you do A, B, and then C, you always add something onto it. All right, so you do no token economy, and then token economy with response costs. And you do that for 10 participants. And all of the 10 participants show that it's a token economy with response costs that was the best condition. You can't make that statement if it's always the third condition, because you're not going to be able to eliminate that it's just not the passage of time that got you there. Okay, now if you have a multiple baseline design, it helps, but if you counterbalance that and you would actually have baseline, then put in token economy with response costs to start off with for some, and some you do it in the third phase, and if you see only when it's token economy with response costs, no matter if it happened in the second phase or the third phase, then you could hang your hat on the fact that it's probably that. So that's why the organization or the sequence is important here, because for a functional analysis that we're doing this across a lot of children. So it wasn't just like you guys are doing this with one child, okay? So before we conditioned anything, we measured stereotypy under a condition under which we only had the items we were going to condition. That's all that was present, okay? Next condition, those items we were going to condition plus items that had been associated with stereotypy. So certain toys, if they spin them or something like that, that we're constantly taking them away from them. All right, third condition, neutral, things that had no impact on their behavior. And then lastly, only items that were previously associated with stereotypy. So what we measure is stereotypy throughout every last one of these phases. Then we stop doing that and we condition. Bum, 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 bum. Criterion met. Now we go back to the same conditions, but we do them in a different order. And we add the target stimuli present only condition again, just to make sure, because now we have a real reason to have a microscope on that section. So we're repeating the condition that we think should have some impact. We don't know if it will or not. Does everybody follow me so far? And does everybody see why this is a functional analysis? Now, it's a functional analysis of stereotypy, which some people would argue that that's not aberrant or bad behavior. Maybe it's not. We all have some stereotypy, right? It's when it impedes your ability to develop language, have friends, or be part of society that it is debilitating. Okay, so let's take this and now look at the data. And I color-coded it so you can follow it a little better. All right, this is just an example. These would target stimuli only, what kind of they look like. Stimuli previously associated with stereotypy. Neutral. I don't even want to get into the scatter plot. We have so much data on this. Aha, here's the big kahuna. All right, so each one of these panels represents 3 of the many children that we had in the study, but they all kind of look like this to a certain degree. So the big black line represents preconditioning on the left and post-conditioning on the right. The conditioning data, that is our independent variable, it's on a different graph. These are the functional analysis data. So just to decode this for you, TS plus SS would be target stimuli plus stimuli associated with stereotypy. SS, stimuli only associated with stereotypy, only. Target stimuli only, neutral. So all the yellows are the same, all the pinks are the same, all the greens are the same, all the blues are the same. So you see how the colors never in the same place. So there is not going to be any problem with the sequence as a confounding variable. All right, so let's look preconditioning. This is before we conditioned what was in those green boxes. All right, do you see any difference in the amount of stereotypy across any of the panels for any of the participants? There's not that much of a difference. You're really not seeing a whole lot when you compare this guy here, TSS plus SS, to this, to this, to this. It all kind of looks the same. And when you do the same thing for this guy, with the exception of this data point here, it all kind of looks the same. So there's no differential before conditioning. We still have quite a bit of stereotypy, no matter how we arrange the environment. Okay, now look, we could even compare participant to participant. All right, now let's look post-conditioning. Let's look at red to red. Not a whole lot of difference. Yellow to yellow. It's going a little bit down, but it's still overall pretty high. Green to green. So now the difference is these were the stimuli we were trying to condition and they weren't. And now when the environment only contained these stimuli, we had lower levels of stereotypy. When they were present with something else, the stimuli associated with stereotypy infected them, and we still got pretty high levels of stereotypy. So follow all the yellows on this side of the panel. Here, oh, clicked. Here, here, and here, compare that to where they were before, they're a little better, but still higher than all the greens. Green, 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 green. Now, did the stereotypy go away? No. But now, post-conditioning, when you manipulate the environment, you are seeing a difference when before it was not possible. So what that tells you is that once something has been conditioned, make sure you've eradicated the environment of things that previously were associated with stereotypes. You've got to change the environment. And that's, I think, you could start applying that to other components of behavior analysis. When something gets learned that's new, you've got to change the environment. You've got to teach differently. When you're working with a child to teach self-monitoring and they can now accurately monitor, then they have to monitor more. So when you're teaching PECs and they're starting to acquire differential between pictures, do that more. I think sometimes we just look at the criteria and we check it off, but we don't change what we're doing. And that leads us into the BIP, and we don't have that much time left. But what I wanted to convey to you is that as you're getting closer to the Holy Grail, figuring out what's the source of reinforcement, keep in mind that those things that you're supposed to be doing before you even start the FA, before you even start analyzing behavior, good, robust instruction, making sure that they're getting a lot of learn units no matter what type of facility you're in, making sure that they're real learn units, not fake ones, making sure that they have a robust reinforcement system. You've got to do those regardless of the function of behavior. That's why in your test on that chapter, on that PowerPoint and on that information about what do you do related to academic instruction when you're dealing with problem behavior, is you've got to make sure that those pieces are in place first. It's impervious to the function. So before you start finding interventions to deal with the function, you can't lose sight that that still needs to be in place. All right. If not, you're going to be like a hamster on the wheel. You're going to stop the head banging and they'll start the skin picking. You're going to stop the running out of the classroom for elopement, but then they'll start putting their head down. You're still going to see the source of the problem still going to be there. It's going to change because you put in an intervention to change just that behavior, but it's not going to change if those other pieces are not fixed. So with that said, a good behavior intervention plan incorporates interventions that address the problem. And what I mean by that is if you've determined that attention is maintaining the problem behavior, then the intervention has to be related to increasing attention for appropriate behavior and decreasing attention for the problem behavior. If it's automatic reinforcement, then the intervention has to be related to making it easier for the individual to contact reinforcement, period. So they don't have to resort to the echolalia, palalia, or physical or motorical stereotypy to obtain reinforcement. That might have to do with conditioning, and that might have to be to do with doing conditioning in a way that's going to lead to conditioning. And so really want you to think about those things. The plan has to match the problem and the source of reinforcement. It's possible you may have to add some punishment procedures. It's possible, but that cannot be the standalone. You cannot write the whole plan off of a punishment procedure. And for me to not take away a substantial amount of points, I would need to see that not just that you've exhausted other procedures, but you have to have other procedures in place. You cannot sustain long-term on punishment. You're going to end up with a person that does nothing because punishment reduces all behavior, right? And if their history is based on punishment, the organism comes to learn how not to do very much. And that's what you get. And I don't know whether you're in a public school or a clinic, but the last time I checked, the target is to get that kid to learn as much as they can in the shortest amount of time possible. So I think next week, Dr. Shanman will unpack the BIP component a little bit more, but hopefully we've killed the horse now. It is dead. And you guys feel a little confident about the process in general and at recording and interpreting the data under those conditions in general. With 2 minutes to spare. All right. But I could be here as long as you'd like, if you have a question.
I have a question. I'm just very concerned that my FA will be inconclusive with my participant. Then what?
So I think that, what is the age of the individual?
He's 12. He's the individual you saw a video of a few weeks back.
Let me make sure we're on the same page. All right, yes. So the likelihood of those behaviors being multiply maintained is fairly high, not because he's 12, but because he has 12 years of instructional history. All right, the age is not the factor. It's what's happened in that time. And how long has he received the behavior analytics services for, intensive ones?
2 months.
Okay, so guys, let's pretend you know nothing about nothing. And you know that somebody is 12 and they have a history of whatever for 12 years and they've gotten intensive services for 2 months. It's going to be inconclusive. Like, I'm almost telling you to bet your money on that. I think what's great is that he's only had 2 months of ABA services. Almost anything you do, as long as it doesn't compromise a robust schedule of reinforcement, making sure that there are ample number of real learn units there, all right? And making sure that he can contact reinforcement pretty easily. That is going to neuter contacting reinforcement for aberrant behavior. That is going to start eating away at it in and of itself. So I think his intervention plan needs to be really getting the programming right and making sure that you have a standing chance of increasing the schedule of reinforcement. Novelty, moving a lot of things around, short burst of access, you know, put him on the carousel of all those things. Again, it's not, you know, I don't want people to think that I'm recommending something that's haphazard or not well thought out. I think that now, if you end up in a place where you do get some conclusive findings, you still have to do those things, but then you have a plus sign. It's all of that plus something else, okay?
Okay, thanks.
All right. And I want you guys to be creative with this. It's a process. You've had to think about it. Maybe you've had to abandon ship on what you already started. You don't need to go back and change your profile of your target participant if you change something. Doing that got you thinking, and that got you on the right track. So it's all connected in some way, shape, or form. The only thing you may have wasted, well, I don't even like to use that word. You may have to look at some more literature. You don't have to redo anything, but you learned about the literature you did review. So that's the only thing you're gonna have to do that might be a little bit extra, but you can certainly change your mind because of a situation that's changed. I get people that do functional analyses on things like this, or just program acquisition, or looking at the right instructional conditions for the highest learn unit of correct responses of learn units. I've gotten people to do FAs on that. Under what conditions are they getting higher correct responses, you know? So there's a lot of different things you can do here. In that case, your interview would be with staff, some of the other staff that work with him, other people that know the child, and so on. So understand the power of a functional analysis is not just limited to aberrant behavior. All right, anything else?
If we do a functional analysis and during the functional analysis, we learn that maybe we should have maybe redefined the behaviors or define the behaviors differently, would you suggest maybe doing like another brief FA where we redefine those behaviors, or would you not?
I think you're going to run out of time, so I'm trying to be realistic here. But just think about how much learning you've done if you get to that point. Now, what I would say ethically, you know, outside of the class, is for the class, turn in what you can in a manageable amount of time that is doable for you to do, write it up and graph it and everything. But for that client's purposes, I mean, you know, one of the things that we are is an applied program. We really want you to help people, okay? So for the student or the client's purposes, I would, but don't worry about including that for your project. Okay? Don't just abandon the client, you know?
Of course, right.
Right. Courtney, I sent it to Dr. Shanman itself. I don't have access to Dr. Shanman's section. Okay, so that's why I asked you to bug him. But he has it. I sent it. Okay.
I'll definitely bug him. Thank you so much.
And then he'll tell me that you bugged him.
Yeah, most likely.
Good. That's what I'm trying to achieve here. Okay. All right. Anything else? I'm not trying to rush you, but I don't want to waste your time. All right. I see a few of you out there. Probably need to follow up with me on a variety of things. Maybe previous conversations about things in general. But anyway, so I'm expecting to hear from you. And don't forget, try to schedule a Zoom with me privately if we need to. All right, a few of you have done that today. I promise you'll get somewhere. All right. Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and your questions, and I hope you learned something tonight. We'll see. See you in 2 weeks.